All right, just a couple more notes on our preface here in Longenecker. Yeah, man, there's one section, a couple of sections actually, that bring up this idea of, while we start studying these different exegetical methods, these ancient Jewish exegetical methods, the question is, did the ancient Jewish interpreters have these concepts detailed and analytically defined the way that we are as we study them? And Longenecker seems to suggest no. He even says modern Jews often find it difficult to think like ancient Jews, and so to analyze the hermeneutics of early Judaism in a manner that is both true to the ancients and understandable today. And Christians have an even greater difficulty. So talking about midrash, he says, when used more narrowly, does it connotate an identifiable literary genre, an attitude more than a method, or simply a type of biblical interpretation which is found in the Jewish biblical commentaries, which the Jews called midrash? In other words, this kind of interpretation is found in the midrash, therefore we call it midrash. Likewise, with regard to the term pesher, which appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls, does it refer to a method of exegesis different from midrash, that is a midrash pesher, or are the two terms to be understood as roughly synonymous? And similar questions can be raised with regard to peshat, or allegorical exegesis. And so I appreciate when Longenecker says about his first edition, at that time I frankly acknowledged, as I continue to acknowledge today, that in dealing with a system that thinks more holistically, functionally, and practically than it does analytically, and that stresses precedent more than logic in defense of its ways, any attempt at classification must necessarily go beyond that system's explicit statements as to its own principles. In other words, kind of like what we've been talking about as we've been going through this week, what does it mean when we apply our modern post-Enlightenment, rationalistic, post-scientific revolution, post-Gutenberg printing press concepts of linear, logical processes upon these ancient oral traditional cultures that, I like how Longenecker says, that often stresses precedent more than logic in defense of its ways. I think it was Raymond F. Person Jr. and I think it was his monograph on comparing Chronicles and Kings that he noted a culture that before the elders could gather together to make a decision for the village or whatever, that they had to first establish basically their ranks as elders, and that was established by the genealogy. They would go through and remind each other of genealogy, so because the genealogy determined kind of the weight that each elder carried. But what the anthropologist noted was that the genealogy never was exactly the same, depending on what thing they were trying to figure out, or just the day, that some elders would have different genealogies that would establish themselves in different positions because it wasn't a consistent logic that governed the culture. It was just simply the precedent that was established at the time. And we look at that and we're like, man, that doesn't make any sense. You got to just have the one true genealogy. And that would be true for our culture, but that's just not the way that every culture operates. And truth for them was what is true. And if we want to find what's true for us, we first have to realize what was true for them. So now, obviously, I'm talking about interpreting the Bible. We have to first say, what did this mean to them? What did God teach them in their culture? And then we can say, well, what does that mean about us in our culture? We have to let the Bible be what it is and what it was. We cannot recreate the Bible in our own image. We can't expect it to be a work of modernity written in some kind of scientific, analytical, perfectly logical worldview. And so sometimes I do think it's worth noting that while some of these terms, it's good, it's helpful for us to be able to categorize and note what we're talking about. I think it's also wise for us to ask the question something like, are all of these methods discovered by modern scholars in the interpretive processes of ancient traditions? Are all of these methods, quote unquote methods that we're discovering, are they just an attempt on our part to systematize a culture that wasn't systematic? Is it our attempt to systematize relational, communal, traditional experience? What we call midrash. And we create a method and define the method and explain how the method always works. Was it a method for them or just an attitude, just a traditio, just a general understood experience of how they used their traditional materials?